We need to stop apologising for the fact we're delivering online and actually start talking about it in a really positive sense and make this the best experience possible for the people that are engaged in the sessions.
Welcome to episode 5 of season 3 of Starts at the Top, our podcast about leadership, digital culture and change. I'm Zoe Amma.
And I'm Paul Thomas. Our podcast brings you interviews with leaders from the public, private and third sector who are using digital to navigate uncertainty and forge a path to the future. On today's episode, we're sharing our conversation from mid-April with Rob Young, who is CEO of Switch the Play Foundation, the UK's only charity dedicated to supporting all sports people to successfully transition into life outside of sport. Delving into sport again, Zoe, we've discussed whether we should be working on a baking-focused podcast, but perhaps we ought to develop a sports-based one too.
Yes, absolutely. I think I might be the wrong person for that, as we've established in previous episodes, but thanks for thinking of me.
Before we introduce our interview with Rob, actually, before we even delve into that, I think we've both had our COVID jabs this week in the last few days. It might be worth just, how were you on that, Zoe?
It was fine, actually. I did feel a bit flu-y the day after, but there's nothing that a bit of paracetamol couldn't help with. And yeah, I was fine within a few days. So if you get offered a jab, I recommend go out there, do it. It's absolutely fine. And you will feel really good once you get in there and you see all those amazing volunteers who are part of this fantastic national effort.
Yeah, they were fantastic. I think the fact that the nurses doing the jabs must have answered the same questions over and over and over again. And when I sat down in front of them, they answered my questions like it was the first time. I thought it was fantastic. On the Tuesday night, I had severe shivers and shakes and all sorts of different things. And I was a bit ropey the next day. But then on the Thursday, as we were sharing on social media, I was out doing one of my fastest 5Ks of the year. So go out and do it, because the impact is, it turns you into a superhuman, apparently. Before we introduce our interview with Rob, then, let's delve into a bit of the tech news from the week. Zoe, what's caught your eye?
So what caught my eye this week is someone shared this really interesting article with me about the impact of Zoom fatigue on various groups. Now, we've talked a lot about video call overload and the joys and sorrows of remote working on this podcast over the last year. I think we're both very much pro remote working, but obviously digital well-being clearly needs to be a real area of priority for all organisations right now. And this was a really interesting article that I saw in Tech Monitor, which was about the impact of Zoom fatigue on women. And that wasn't an issue which I'd actually come across before, which I thought was fascinating. And we'll share the link to this in the show notes. So basically what this says is that almost 3 times as many women report being extremely fatigued by video conferencing, and that some of the thinking, the reason behind this apparently, is that women tend to have more punishing video call schedules with calls that take longer, less average break times between meetings, and some of the obviously big effects of burnout and overload that actually come with that. Now, I think this article is a really tantalizing glimpse into this pattern, but doesn't answer all the questions about why that might be. Like, why are women having longer calls? Why do they have less breaks? And we don't yet know why that is. Maybe there'll be future studies where we'll find out more about that. I thought this was really interesting, and again raises the point about how we need to make sure that remote work is inclusive for everyone, and that we're just giving people space at the moment to take a break. It's much needed.
Yeah, no, I would totally agree. And one of the articles that I thought that we could talk about sort of dovetails nicely with that, which was an article that was on the BBC. But again, that dovetails with something else I was listening to the other day, listening to the Commode and Mayo film podcast. At this point, I should say hello to Jason Isaacs, so we can just find out how many Wittertainment followers we've got listening to this podcast. But it was when they were away and they were talking, the presenters were talking about Cate Blanchett's new film, Apples, which apparently is about a worldwide pandemic. So that'll be fun. But this pandemic causes sudden amnesia. And they were talking about screen time and perhaps, how we're at some point, some sort of breaking point with our reliance on screens. And yeah, both you and I being fairly pro working from home, I think the difficulty is sometimes just stepping away and finding those ways to do that. And I think as leaders, we are after all podcasting about leadership and digital. And there was an article on the BBC that I think is worth pointing out that backs all this up, which was about sort of taking breaks from screens. Again, we'll put a link into the show notes. But there was a quote from a guy called Nick Hederman, who's the modern work lead at Microsoft, and he'd sort of talked about leaders creating a positive remote culture, which I thought was an interesting phrase, which is quite difficult when you're not in the same room as your employees. But how they could do that by shortening meetings to 20 and 40 minutes rather than half an hour and an hour. And I think we've talked about that before. It's something that I always try to do. Conducting team check-ins that aren't related to work. And also something that I'm absolutely keen on and try and do as much as I can, scheduling voice-only walking meetings. So you're out and about and you're on your phone rather than wedded to a screen. And not only does that get you out and about on a change of scenery, but it also, I think, opens up your brain. It opens up your mind and you think differently, and you might have a different conversation if you do sort of get out and move away from the screen. And the other thing that was in there that I thought was interesting was there was a section on being active at the desk. And I have a standing desk. And I think rather than just Zoom fatigue, a standing desk leaves you at the end of the day with actual fatigue as well, which is quite good because you're on your feet all day. But it's well worth having a look at that. And the other thing I just thought would be interesting is over the weekend, we talked in the last episode about the European Super League and how that was affecting football. And this time football again, but the footballers and football clubs and sports presenters and all sorts of different organisations who went on the football boycott of social media. I think that was managed incredibly well. Everyone sort of blacked out over the course of Friday afternoon all the way through to Monday. This was interesting because as somebody, and you and I both work with clients on social media projects, and obviously I'd like to take a stand on myself by saying that standing up to racism and on online abuse and all the sorts of things that are happening on these channels. And I think it's interesting looking at parts of the world or parts of the industries where they can afford, I think, to take more time off of these screens. But I think we both have sort of our socio-economic future is based on our ability to be on social media. But anyway, there was an article in Wired this week about the future of social media being about sharing less, not more. The subheading was, "We may never leave social media completely, but we can control what aspects of our identities we share and with whom." And I think it's interesting because we're starting to become more conscious of what we share, when, with whom, and developing a more curated view of our lives and our work and how we can stay authentic to ourselves at the same time. So, yeah, I don't know what you think about that, Zoe, and better curating your online profile.
I think we're all at a point where we are making probably more deliberate choices about what we're choosing to share and not share online, partly because the environment has changed so much. And I know that a lot of people are worried about things like cancel culture and saying the wrong thing, and people have become quite self-censoring in many ways. And then equally, it feels like there's perhaps not enough censorship in other areas. So we're recording this on the day that the Facebook Oversight Board have announced that they've given Donald Trump what I would call a stay of execution. They've said that the ban's going to remain in place for the time being, but I think it's going to be reviewed in 6 months, if I've got that right. And that seems pretty absurd to me, given the scale of what he's done. So I think that it feels like there's some massive inconsistencies in the culture on social media platforms at the moment. There are people who are trying to put a lot of rules around themselves, and then there are some people who are still relatively unfettered and where there isn't enough accountability. I think leaving the door open for Trump like that sends out some very worrying signals to other world leaders who may be doing lots of unethical things.
I think for a few days people thought, because there was this announcement, was it yesterday, where they said that this new communications platform was being launched by Trump, and everyone assumed that he was launching his own social network. And I just thought, I looked at some of the stuff that he's been putting on this platform, which is essentially it's a website, isn't it, with his thoughts, and he just keeps going on there and updating little blog posts and sharing them out to the world. These channels, it's amazing to me that even sort of, what are we now, sort of 15 years, coming up to 15 years into this sort of social media journey that we're all on, that we still just don't have a clue how to use them. and it keeps coming round and round again. We sort of approach it in one way, we approach it in a different way, but the maturity of these platforms and the maturity of the users on them, it's a discussion I just think that's never going to go away, which is good because it probably keeps you and me in business for a little bit longer.
Now for our conversation with Rob Young of Switch the Play Foundation. We spoke to Rob in mid-April and had a fascinating discussion, not only about the impact of the pandemic and a switch to digital delivery, but also about the impact of the pandemic on sports people and how the foundation works to help athletes transition to a world beyond sport.
So we would like to welcome Rob Young to the podcast today. Rob co-founded Switch the Play, having seen both the positive and negative sides of transition in sport and deciding that there was a need to support the industry in helping to ensure that transition, whenever it occurs, could be a stepping stone to achieving other great things in life. Rob's experience across a range of roles in sport includes Olympic, Paralympic and Commonwealth Games, work with the national governing bodies of sport, professional sport, national and local government, and further in higher education. For 6 years, Rob worked on the London 2012 Olympic Games and Paralympic Games, for which he was awarded an MBE in 2013. Rob became CEO of Switch the Play in February 2021, and he joins us today. Welcome, Rob.
Hello, thank you very much.
So we're going to have a general conversation, but the first thing first, tell us about the Switch the Play the Foundation. How did you start? What's your mission and what's your role as CEO?
Great, well, thank you. I think it's one of those interesting things where you want to be able to say that there was this grand plan and vision that we had at the outset. I think it started from 4 individuals that had connections from our days as students at Loughborough University and some of our experiences there around sport. And through different roles that we'd been in sport, we had informally been helping people who had faced challenges in their exit from sport. And I think we came together and recognized and felt actually that, is there an opportunity to do more? Could we do better? Can we play a role in this? And from those conversations, we went, well, let's try and do something. And that sort of really was the origins of where Switch the Play came up with, from an idea and an aspiration to help people. And then gradually, bit by bit, we connected to other people that brought different skills, knowledge to the conversation. And what we recognized from starting out with a conversation about the challenges faced by young people, particularly leaving a sport like football, when you actually looked at it, that transition was just as difficult if you have been an established professional or high-level athlete over a full career. Actually, the issues and challenges were the same. Sometimes where the decimal point in the salary might be different but actually there was so much commonality around some of the challenges that people were facing. And really that's where we felt that we wanted to try and help people to not just avoid those negative challenges, but actually to be able to thrive in whatever they chose to do next. In terms of our mission, so we are the only charity in the country that focuses on supporting all sports people, any stage in their career, to successfully transition to life outside of sport. I say outside deliberately rather than after, because actually much of what we talk about is actually things that people can do while still competing. It's not about just simply about retirement. It's about how you develop yourself as a person. We do that through providing personal development support, career support, well-being support for individuals, and really trying to help them, empower them to find out where their skills are, what they're passionate about, and help them to find the path of what they want to do next.
And what about specifically your role as CEO?
Yes. So I recently took over in February of this year. As a co-founder, it's an interesting lesson around why even Switch the Play exists in the first place. So I had my own sports consultancy business, which was actually the reason why I think in many respects Switch the Play exists, because I was my own boss. And so I could throw some time into this passion project that ultimately eventually became a charity. Our former chief executive, Leon Lloyd, who's still involved in our work, who's a former Leicester Tigers and England international, moving on into some other areas of business and development. And the opportunity came up where the trustees said, would I be interested? And as somebody who probably many people would say hasn't had a proper job for 8 years, it was an interesting conversation I hadn't thought about. And it's a real privilege to be able to lead the charity. It's not something that I necessarily envisaged myself being somebody who started up businesses and entered into these roles. But I'm really excited about what the opportunity is and the difference we're trying to make.
Our podcast has largely been focused on this idea of leadership and what leadership is needed to, or what leadership looks like in the digital age, I guess. But the impact of the pandemic is also something that we've come up with time and time again in these conversations. It's been felt right across the world of sport. Everything from Parkrun to Euro 2020 has been cancelled or postponed. So how has the pandemic affected your operations? And also, how does it affect the sports people that Switcher Play is working with day in, day out?
So firstly, on the operations, I guess there's probably two sides to it. One is clearly the challenges that we faced. So we converted to a charity in February 2020, so 6 weeks before the pandemic hits, which perhaps not the ideal time in many respects, because we're trying to transition from a business model that was around social enterprise to being one that was exclusively around charity. And there were a number of events, which was sort of one of the low-hanging fruit for us, about events where we were the named beneficiary of, that were getting cancelled. So you start to identify income where you're being prudent, and then all of these events start throughout the year, kept getting cancelled, which means that we were constantly having to adjust our business plan. In terms of accessing new funding streams, that was really difficult. And lots of charities would have faced similar challenges, but unless you were an established grant-funded organisation of certain organisations, you weren't going to be coming in as a new organisation to be able to access support. And a lot of organisations pivoted to supporting frontline services around the pandemic, which is completely understandable. So that was a difficult space to be in from some financial standpoint. Operationally, though, it was interesting because we had all of our delivery, which was face-to-face, cancelled overnight. So we had to make that adjustment. But the other side of the coin around, well, what was the situation like for sports people? Well, arguably, they never needed our services more than over the last 12 months because of the level of uncertainty about contracts being renewed, future career, cancellation of Olympic, Paralympic Games, etc., that were all creating a pressure point. And there's lots of evidence about what the mental health challenges for sports people have been during the pandemic and the concerns and uncertainty. So we needed to make sure that we were actually fulfilling our charitable purpose and delivering services. And the way that we did that is we took the jump earlier than we ever planned to do, and we were perhaps overcomplicating what it might look like, but we needed to deliver our services online. So all of our masterclasses, we then had to think about how we would develop and deliver them in a meaningful and engaging way in an online format. We were offering lots of stuff out for free. We were also able to engage sports people in a different way because some of them had more time. So there was a willingness for them to look at some of these services that hadn't been previously. But you also had the opportunity where you could deliver to a geography whereby it isn't about putting people in a room, but actually you could deliver to sports people anywhere in the country, which far opened up the opportunity in terms of the people that we could engage with. So in terms of what we actually managed to do last year, we reached just around 1,100 beneficiaries, which is more than we've done before. So I'm incredibly proud of the team's efforts in being able to achieve that through the challenges that were faced for the charity over that period of time.
That's a huge achievement, and digital service delivery is something that we talk about a lot on the podcast, and is also a question that we get asked about a lot as part of our day jobs. And of course, the big question is always, how did you do it? How did you pivot? So can you tell us a bit more about the process you went through and some of your learnings?
Yeah, I think there's a bit about being comfortable with the platform that you're using and understanding the platform and what the platform can and can't do. So if you're looking at platforms like Zoom, it's like these concepts that people are familiar with now, like breakout rooms, and how do you create interaction with people? When you started out at first, like just some of the etiquette around using this was because it was new for everybody. So you're learning that at the same time as thinking about how you deliver. So we pride ourselves around delivering really interactive sessions, particularly with sports people that they could be quite apprehensive about coming into some of the sorts of sessions that we might run. And you want to make it engaging, you want to make it fun. And the reality of that is that's a very different challenge when you're doing it in an online forum, especially when you're then mixing up groups of people that may not know each other. So there is that personal comfort. So we tried different things. So our operations manager sort of oversees what we describe as our minimum operating standards. So we have those standards of what we try and do for our face-to-face delivery, and we had to write those same standards for what we do with our online delivery. And what we then do is, as a team of deliverers, is share the little tactics that people would use that worked well to work with different groups. And we'd try and share, well, actually, if we're dealing with an under 16 group, this worked really well. Well, a different tactic might work better with a different group, and trying to constantly review, check and challenge ourselves to get to a point where, as one of our associates said, we need to stop apologizing for the fact we're delivering online and actually start talking about it in a really positive sense and make this the best experience possible for the people that are engaged in the sessions.
I love that idea of sharing tactics. Really brilliant, because I think there's centralized learning is a big challenge for a lot of the organisations that we've spoken to, because so many things have been happening at pace with digital service delivery. It's quite easy for things to become siloed. So I love that you've got this way of sharing that. And do you think that's almost a kind of sports type mindset that you've brought across there, that way, that sharing of tactics and looking at where things can be transferred and relevant for different situations?
It's a great question, and I lean to sort of my thinking when you say that is of Leon. And Leon is, as an individual I know, is like somebody who's competed at the highest level in his sport. I've never seen anyone so willing to embrace feedback as him. And it's all from his sporting environment. I don't get better unless someone gives me feedback, and I'm constantly striving to be better. So he actively searches for feedback, and he's happy for it to be honest, blunt, constructive, but like being that hoover of the feedback, because then actually that's how you can then learn and get better. So it's something that I guess is really embedded in the culture of what we do, is we really do ask, we do really do challenge ourselves to think, how could it be better? So we have a team code, and on our team code, we have one of our sort of little areas we talk about is around being positively dissatisfied. So we have the feedback one, but we also have positively dissatisfied. So like that, always striving to be a little bit better. So there's probably a little bit about the sporting mentality that runs in that, and it's getting that balance right, that you don't miss the celebration of success at the same time. But yeah, definitely, I think learning and feedback is the only way to actually improve ultimately.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a very digital mindset.
And as a company that probably wouldn't say that we were particularly digital savvy, that's quite a nice thing to hear.
Well, you often find that where you go into an organization who wants to make change, that when you talk about digital transformation, for example, it's often about getting from present state to this massively future state that's quite scary, where it's all AI and robots and things like that. But actually, when you sit down and look at the processes that you're already running, or the natural way that you have of working, you can show that there are incremental steps and stepping stones to get to that point. So it's just lovely to hear it in action. The big question is, cameras on or cameras off on Zoom?
It's interesting because some of the organizations you work with have etiquette that they want to put on. I think what we try to do is cameras on, because you're seeing people in the room. That's certainly how we try to do the sessions. Some organizations don't follow that principle, so you almost have to fit within what they do, but it's difficult to get the interaction with people, isn't it?
It's so difficult. And actually, like to throw in a personal story of my son and his work during the second lockdown. And I walked into his room at one point. I can't remember what lesson it was, but I've got a feeling it was something like science. And I just heard the teacher at the beginning of the session literally pleading with the class that please put your cameras on. I have no idea whether you're listening or engaging or anything. And it's really hard to tell. So yeah, cameras on all the way for me at least. You must speak to sports people on literally a daily basis. So what are you hearing from them about the major challenges they're facing at this time as well? We discussed on our previous conversation, we discussed how that might be different, for example, for a Premier League footballer versus an athlete who is doing their sport part-time.
Yeah, and I think so for some of the sport that has continued throughout the pandemic, you've got a challenge around, I guess, life in the bubble, because people have been very much in this bubble, being tested regularly, very restricted about who they can engage with and the interaction around it. And people might look at it, well, aren't you lucky because you can still do your job? But I think we sometimes ignore what that might mean in terms of being able to have contact with family and friends, because actually that social connection is something that we've all strived for. But actually, that's been really strict throughout the whole pandemic on those people in those positions. For a lot of professional sports people, there has been huge uncertainty about contracts being renewed, the financial uncertainty that exists around clubs and their survival through this process. And, it feels a lot safer now in terms of where we're talking about it. But there were some quite serious conversations about clubs being really at threat of their existence and what that means then in terms of all the players and their contracts. So there's a huge uncertainty there for people. When you take it to Olympic and Paralympic world, and perhaps one of the biggest things you've got is the postponement of Tokyo 2020. And to be fair, it's still not 100% that it's going ahead. And you've got people that have trained their entire life to peak for that moment, and suddenly the date gets moved 12 months or maybe not at all. And for some people, that's 12 months too far. If you think about female athletes we've seen who talked about that, is in terms of maybe planning to have families and things like that. Huge implications on people's lives that people perhaps don't consider. that whilst, yes, you're incredibly fortunate to be representing your country, to potentially have the rug pulled on your dream and something that you have literally given your body and soul for, not for financial reward, that's a tough thing to take. And then at the other end of the spectrum, some of the sort of smaller, when we're more defined as semi-professional sports, a number of the sports people are what you'd call dual career. So we know of people, say, in netball, Super League, there'll be a number of players in that have a day job. So how they're trying to combine a day job whilst the protocols and all of the bubbles and COVID secure environments that need to be in place for the sporting side of things. And some of these doctors and teachers, that's a really, really difficult thing to juggle. So it is different depending on where you're at in the sporting thing. And I say that acknowledging completely that whatever sector you are in, people have had challenges. I think it's just recognizing that sports people are no different in that respect, in terms of the fact that it has certainly not been an easy time.
I'm a season ticket holder for a Premier League club, and a lot of the discussion around that at the moment, I think getting towards the end of the season is starting to turn towards that idea that sports people are humans too. And particularly the Premier League and the top leagues across the world have been asked to step up and continue pretty much as normal. In fact, in most instances, more than normal, because the games are coming thick and fast. There isn't a night that you don't sit in front of the TV without football on, for example. But the toll that's ultimately taking on them. So what about the mental health implications of this? We're seeing, I think even in the news today, the discussion around Liverpool exiting the Champions League last night, for example, there was as much discussion about the players just looking tired and done in from the year that they've had as there was about the changes that Liverpool might need to make to their team, for example. But that's the first time I've seen that referenced in the major media. It's just been in sort of low-level discussions, podcasts and things like that, where they seem to be paying much more attention to the players and their specific mental health needs at the moment.
Yeah, I think firstly, it's positive that people are starting to talk about mental health. And I think there was a point in the past where people looked at, say, a Premier League footballer and go, well, how can you have a mental health problem? You're earning X £1,000 a week. Your life's great. But actually, that's the point. We all have mental health. And we're all somewhere on a spectrum of that. And that can change over time, depending on the circumstances around us. It's a massive part of the challenges that we face around helping sports people in transition. Probably the number one thing that everyone talks about is that loss of identity. So if your identity is intrinsically linked to being a sports person, that's like stripping someone's identity away as soon as you take away the sport from them. So I think that's a massive part of it. But we have to recognize, and that's why a really important part of this is we are all people first. There's a lot of language that's starting to circulate through high performance sport where they're talking about person and performer, rather than just thinking of people as almost robotic sports people that just go out and do what they are supposed to do on the field of play. And actually, we're not recognizing that people all have feelings, and actually some of the things you can do to support people in a positive way will actually also have a positive performance benefit as well, because they'll feel energized, refreshed. You'll give them a different perspective. There's lots of different things in there and evidence around some of those ways in which you can help create an environment where there is positive mental well-being. So yeah, it's a huge issue in sport, and unfortunately, sadly, you see examples, and some relatively recently, of sports people taking their own life, and that's incredibly sad. And yeah, I guess part of what we try to do as a charity is very much to take a preventative role around that and do the things you can do to help support people, put in place a plan to help them prepare for life outside of sport, to try and take some of those concerns that might be there away from them.
And can we talk a bit more about that moment of transition? Because as you say, it's such a pivotal one. And I think we were discussing this a bit when we first spoke to you a few weeks ago, where we were talking about how this kind of professional transition is something that so many people are going to have to go through multiple times, particularly when we think about kids of today and when they enter the workforce and all those predictions about jobs spinning up and then being automated within 5 years. So is there any general advice that you'd give to anyone who's perhaps facing a career change right now, or perhaps even someone who may be facing one 10 years from now, where they're going to have to pivot quickly, but also think about what their transferable skills are?
I guess the ideal part that we would always say to people is try and plan early. So a lot of what we see where the challenges come up, where people maybe have not done that preparation work, not thought about it soon enough, or, as happens a lot of case, you are one injury away from the end of your career. So it can come up on you like that. We talk a lot about the change curve, and it's an academic model that's taken around grief counselling and addiction counselling. And it talks about the stages of that change, and it's any change in life. But when we talk through sports people through that, they suddenly start to recognise themselves in that story about the denial, the anxiety, what they describe as the valley of despair and that dip, and ultimately the experimentation phase to try and come through it, and ultimately finding fulfillment. So that's the way that we describe what we do, is we try and help people to find whatever their fulfillment post-sport might look like. And that's a personal thing, but you've got to recognize there are stages that you will go through, and we want to shallow that curve for people and to give them some of the tools and skills that will help them to make that. And some of that is about recognizing that we do have transferable skills. So there's a lot of academic research that talks about sports people, and they talk about what they described as new era employability skills. So the stuff around teamwork, the motivation that you see to get up and train at 5 o'clock in the morning every day of the year, those things are not necessarily ingrained everywhere across the general public. And I even still take to the point of remember being sat in a purple tracksuit back in my days with 300 students all studying sport, and they had a careers session, and I always remember the advice was, they said 30% of you will be an accountant, because accountancy and other firms recognize the intrinsic skills that sports people have, and they can train you to be an accountant, but those skills that you get through sport are hugely valuable. And it's just recognizing, and sometimes that's about translation more than transferable, in the sense of helping people to recognize that when a job description asks for a particular skill, they mean this. And by the way, that's what you did in sport for the last 20 years.
I think we had that discussion just this week, Zoe, about leadership. You were listening to that podcast about Alex Ferguson's leadership style and things like that. And quite often you see the business world looking at the sporting world for those examples of, how did you manage to keep this elite team at that level for a consistent period of time, and what lessons we can learn from those worlds. Where do you see the biggest gaps, though? Where's the biggest transition that sports people need to make? Because some of the examples I think that I've looked at on the website, for example, are really nice examples of Beth Tweddle, for example, who was doing the gymnastics at the same time as starting to build for that career. And some sports people will be preparing in the background, but others will suddenly find themselves out of contract or at the end of a contract with literally nowhere to turn. And where do you see the biggest challenges?
That's a really tough question. There's a personal bit of me that looks at young sports people that have the dream and may not quite make it. And in any elite system, there is always a point where only the very few make it through that pathway. And actually, particularly when you talk about a young person, that's their childhood. At the most fundamental level, people are giving up their childhood to follow a sporting dream. And there is a duty of care that the system and sport has to ensure that those individuals have positive well-being, are supported, have positive experiences, and are given some tools that will help them to succeed in their life outside of sport. So there's something personal, I think, really important there about young people, and where that duty of care really lies strongly with sport. I think all the evidence shows that transition is hardest where it's forced upon you, where it might be the career-ending injury or the contract not renewal, that piece, or the being taken off funding from an Olympic or Paralympic perspective. That's the bit where it's the sudden jolt. And even if you've laid some of the foundations, that's a really tough process to go through. I've heard sports people talk about the example of how often is it that you lose your hobby, your friendship network, and your job all on the same day. That's what the end of your career can be like. And if that is a day that you do not see coming and you have not planned for, there is inevitably, there was a podcast I'd seen recently talking about it, there's a grieving period that people have to go through. So I do think that that's a real area of challenge that sport has. And I'm really encouraged that there is some fantastic work that goes on across a number of the player associations to try and support athletes through this. There is an inevitability that there's there's a group of people that are very proactive that will be on it and look to help themselves. There's a group that will always be really difficult to engage, no matter what you do and what support you provide. And there's a big group in the middle. And the more that we can help that big group in the middle and really try and change the culture around sport, that developing yourself as a person is something that is positive and can actually help performance, and not just about thinking about plan B and life after sport, because the inherent risk of that approach is that no one ever puts as much effort into plan B. We put our effort into plan A, don't we? So until you actually change that mindset and recognize that actually doing some of this stuff now and the concept of better people makes better sports people, then that's part of the challenge. I think we've got to, we're trying to change a culture here to really ensure that actually long-term change means that more people are coming out and having a positive transition experience rather than some of the negative examples that you see around mental health, financial pressures, relationship pressures, etc., etc. etc.
It's really interesting. I've got a 16-year-old nephew who currently plays for Fulham, and all the reports are that he's doing well and he's in the academy there. But he's getting to the point at 16 where that first contract is looming, I imagine. I certainly witnessed firsthand where one of his friends, literally one when we were around there, was in the same group in the same team, and was told, you're no longer required, and it happens overnight. And as you say, for young people who are building all of their dreams around this idea, it must be really, really tough. And also, I imagine that there's extra pressure on them from parents and expectations around them, particularly at that point. Somebody said to me last night, where we were discussing this at my son's football training, that he's a school teacher and he sees kids that transition into football teams. Watford is a local academy here that does really well, but there's pressure that's put on them within their peer network, within their family network. Oh yeah, John, he's the kid that plays football for Watford or plays foot, and then as soon as they're let go, then that sort of crashes down around them. So it's massively important. Glad you're there to be able to support it.
And I think it's a really good point, because part of what we try to do is think about the support network around the individual. So there's a bit about the culture from a coaching perspective. You're thinking about the agents and their role in terms of trying to encourage some of these messages, the family. And ultimately, if you yourself haven't been through a high performance sport environment and you've got a child that's going through that, you don't know what sort of questions to ask, how hard to push. Like when someone says this is the way it is, there's a danger that we normalize behaviors that shouldn't be the norm within a sporting environment. Really important that we help parents to understand how they can positively support their children in that environment. And yes, there are examples you hear where the risk is that they see their child as effectively their retirement plan, and that can be really difficult ultimately in terms of the pressure that you're putting on a young person.
And having said that, I'm taking my son to a trial with another team tonight, and I'd like to stay on the record that I'm not seeing you, Ethan, as my retirement plan yet. But let's see how you do tonight.
So many people who we've interviewed has told us that the pandemic has obviously really accelerated digital adoption in their industries and changes as well. And we've talked a bit about that and how you've pivoted. So what has pivoting to digital enabled in your world that wasn't possible before?
So it enables us to engage people in a different way, because we can take geography out of the equation and be able to deliver targeted programs to individuals who need them, as opposed to just working through sporting organizations where you'll have really diverse groups of people at all different stages. So if you think about delivering to an under-18 academy team, there is still quite a variety within that group. One of the new services that we delivered, first program we delivered last year, was 6-week online bootcamp program targeting those that were coming up to the end of their career or recently retired. Now, that was something that if we were thinking about that pre-pandemic, we were thinking about the logistics of trying to get a venue and trying to bring people together maybe around a weekend concept and things like that, and the cost that goes into trying to run a program like that. We can be much more nimble, and we subsidize that program fully as a charity, and it's not an insignificant cost. But that would be 3 times as hard to try and logistically deliver that and also subsidize that level of investment if you're trying to do that by putting people in a room face to face. So that's a really good example of how we've been able to pivot in a really positive way. One of the things that we're trying to get to, and I guess where this sort of digital adoption point comes, is trying to be able to provide support to sports people, the support they need when they need it. So if we're running a webinar around a particular career pathway, actually there's the number of people that can engage in that when we run it. But if we're able to create, using digital to create online platforms that people can then go back in and engage in that content at a different point in time, because where they are in their lives is relevant to that content, that enables our content to have much more value across a longer period of time and to more people. So I think there's really exciting things that we can do there, because ultimately that journey and where people are at actually just gives you much more flexibility about how we can engage people. We haven't got that nailed yet, and that's the bit in the plan, but it's helping us to look at things in a different way. And we've been having conversations with different platforms and exploring about the different way that we might do that. And that's getting quite exciting, about suddenly opening your eyes to the types of platforms that exist and what you can then start to do and how you can really use it to help your beneficiaries.
So where do you see the next challenges? I mean, we've talked about what digital has enabled now. Where do you see the next challenges when it comes to digital for Switch the Play?
I'll give you a challenge and an opportunity, if I may. So I think there's a challenge and something we want to look at around, so speaking to sports people about looking back, what were the things that would help you through that transition? And one of the things that came out and has stuck with us, and we're like, we need to start thinking about this came out quite recently, was digital skills. So it's not something necessarily a lot of sports people have in terms of IT digital skills. So when they're starting to think about transitioning into a working environment, maybe going to professional services or whatever, their knowledge of that stuff is way behind maybe what their peers might be. So how we can maybe help to get those sort of core skills alongside all of the other stuff that sports people have to help them all be work ready for whatever that second career might look like, I think is an interesting area. And then in terms of opportunity, we're really passionate about the role that sport can play to deliver a social impact. And sports people as role models can do a fantastic job. And you talked about Marcus Rashford as probably the most high profile and best example of that. Well, a lot of the way that Marcus Rashford has done that is he's used his voice through social media to engage a huge audience. And I think there's huge opportunity that going beyond what sports people do, maybe in terms of supporting local community foundations for their clubs and organizations, but how they can use their platform in a positive way. So rather than seeing social media as a don't do this, don't do that, actually in terms of the brand that they have and the voice that they have, is being able to really help influence positive change. But in doing so, that might be something that helps them to follow an area of passion, open a perspective on something different in life, that all helps them to develop new skills and helps to give them some support to help develop them for what their opportunities are, both on the field and off the field. And we've done some work in this space where we've seen sports people saying, well, actually volunteering for this organization has actually made me a better sports person because it's made me more confident. So I think there's huge opportunities in that space that creates the win-win in terms of helping the sports person to develop themselves, but also be able to give back to society.
When you were talking then at the end, I was just thinking back to last week, I think, or earlier this week, when Jordan Henderson, did you see what he did on social media? Did you see this, Zoe, that there's been a number of different sports people reacting to the social media online abuse? Thierry Henry was the first person to say, well, I'm coming off the platforms until
he's left Twitter, hasn't he?
Yeah.
Oh, so yeah.
Until this gets sorted out. And a couple of clubs, I think Bristol City were one, and a couple of others that said, well, we're coming off for a month, for a week. And I think it will take a big club to do something along those lines. But if you go on to Jordan Henderson's Twitter feed at the moment, he basically sort of put a bunch of tweets out that said he was going to do it, but he's handed his entire feed and therefore his millions of connections over to Cybersmile at Cybersmile HQ. And they are an anti-online abuse charity, and they are now using his feed and using his platform to speak to a whole new audience of people that, and I just think that's a fantastic idea, and one way that many sports people could, particularly footballers who are in this maelstrom of abuse and awful racism at the moment, a way of using their platform for absolute good.
Yeah, we saw that last week. It's brilliant, and I guess that sort of shows how you can turn it to the positive, isn't it? Supporting a social cause in that instance around the topic around cyberbullying affects so many people, and sports people have certainly been at the forefront of that, haven't they?
Well, thank you very much for coming on to the podcast.
Thank you so much. That was fascinating. I speak as someone who, as you know, Paul, is a real novice about sport, but this has just been completely fascinating and really eye-opening. So thank you so much, Rob.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you to Rob. I love all of our interviews, but given my interest in sport, I found this one fascinating. I think the big takeaways for me were when Rob talked about the transition out of sport, often being forced in some instances. So career-ending injuries and things like that, leaving you completely unprepared for life after sport, and the mental effect that can have on athletes. And also, I thought the points about duty of care to kids. I think I might have mentioned before, but my nephew he's coming up to 17 and he plays for Fulham. And so he's dedicated the last few years of his life to developing his football and sporting career as well. And I think the idea that children who dedicate their childhoods to sport and then are rejected at the last because they're not going to make it, I think is also there's a massive impact there on mental health and well-being. So Vital Charity doing some vital work.
Yes, I thought it was absolutely fascinating and made me think about all the transferable skills that athletes have and also that anyone will have when changing career. So it was a really enlightening conversation for me from that perspective.
definitely. The skills that they can take into the workplace, and how lots of sports people end up in professional services, which I thought was interesting as well. We normally do a spot here on books and music. Zoe, you've made a recommendation to me about a book you've just read, and we're going to try our best to get the authors on the podcast.
Yes, we are indeed. And we'll be able to say a bit more about that once we know more.
I'm getting towards the end of Clara and the Sun, by the way, so perhaps we can talk about that one next week.
Yes, we can. Sounds good.
So thank you for listening to episode 5 of season 3. We'll be back next week with another episode.
As usual, please send us your feedback. We'd love to hear about anything that you feel that you will do differently after hearing from any of our speakers from the series. You can share your plans, ideas, or questions with us on Twitter. We're at startsatTheTop1, and you can email us at startsatthetoppodcast@gmail.com.
And if you wouldn't mind, and you're listening to this on Apple iTunes or anywhere else that you can leave a review, please do. It really does help us. Thank you, and we'll speak to you again next week.
Thank you. See you next week.